Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the singular piece of music most likely to fail on recordings. And drum roll, I mean lots of drum rolls. The work in question is the Berlioz Requiem. This piece has had more failures per capita than any other work I can think of. I mean, there are lots of works that usually do badly on recordings, but this one really takes the prize. And the reason is a combination of lack of vision on the part of the performers and ineptitude on the part of the engineers. And this was driven home to me, actually, in considering two recordings, both of which are failures in their own unique ways, which came out recently. There was this one, featuring John Nelson, who has been a splendid Berlioz conductor. He really is. He's a wonderful Berliozian. But, oh, this is awful. With the London Philharmonic Choir, the Philharmonia Chorus, the Philharmonia Orchestra, and it was recorded live in St. Paul's Cathedral, London. Big mistake, which we'll get to in a moment. Then the other one was this one that just came out on the Concertgebouw's own label with Antonio Pappano and the Santa Cecilia Chorus and the Concertgebouw and a tenor. They all have a tenor. It doesn't make any difference who the tenor is for our purposes. But these are both modern, stunning, theoretically digital recordings. This one comes with a bonus DVD of the entire performance, so you can watch the wreck of the Titanic in lovely video. I mean, it's just no point. Anyway, okay, so here they are. They suck. Now, why is that? First, let's talk a little bit about the piece itself. The Requiem, which Berlioz termed the Grande Messe des Morts, the Great Mass of the Dead, is a public piece. It's a celebratory piece. Celebratory not necessarily meaning happiness, but a piece for a public occasion in a grand space. And Berlioz was not kidding with his grand space. Let's see what forces he asks for, shall we? All right. It begins, actually, with a basic orchestra. Now, the basic orchestra does not include the brass section, other than the horns. That's a whole separate deal, and the percussion. But the basic orchestra is, you ready? Here we go. 4 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 English horns, 4 clarinets, 12 horns, I'm not kidding, 8 bassoons, and then we've got the violins, which he said should be 25 first, 25 seconds, 20 violas, 20 cellos, and 18 basses. That is immense. Now, the choral forces are, 80 sopranos and altos, 80 tenors 1 and 2, 70 basses 1 and 2. So that basic choral force is what? 80 plus 80 is 160, plus 70 is 200 and something or whatever. You know, you add it up. And then there's a footnote. The footnote is just marvelous. Berlioz is just great. He writes, let me get here, I have to look at it because it's tiny print. The numbers indicated are only relative. If the space permits, the chorus may be doubled or tripled, and the orchestra be proportionately increased. But in the event of an exceptionally large chorus, say 700 or 800 voices, the entire chorus should only be used for the dies irae, the tuba miram, and the lacrimosa. The rest of the movements being restricted to only a mere 400 voices. Yeah. Okay, so that's your basic grouping. Now, it goes without saying that most modern performances are considerably smaller. I mean, they just are. It's incredibly expensive to get a group like that together, and you got to find a space where they can perform, which is not going to be your typical average concert hall. Nonetheless, the piece works superbly well in your typical average concert hall. It really does. And I know because I saw 2 splendid performances. I saw a really good one with Dutoit in New York Philharmonic in nasty old Avery Fisher Hall, and a very fine one with Gary Bertini in the Jerusalem Symphony, in whatever hall they call it in Jerusalem. It worked just great with the basic group. Usually you combine a couple choruses or something to get as many singers as you can, but the basic grouping was there. Now, that's your fundamental orchestra. Then you have what he said, the Dies Irae, the Tuba Miram, and the Lacrimosa, the big moments, and the Rex Tremendi. I mean, the Dies Irae is, a sequence. It's a whole pile of pieces where things come and go. So the big forces come and go appropriately, as befits the text. So now I'm going to jump ahead now to the Tuba Miram, which is when all hell really breaks loose, and oh my goodness, it's just a marvelous thing. Okay, so to those basic forces, Berlioz adds, are you ready for this? 4 brass bands. I am not kidding. 4 wonderful brass bands. And these include, you ready? Brass band north, 4 cornets, 4 trombones, and 2 tubas. And east, 2 trumpets, 2 more trumpets, so it's 4 trumpets and 4 trombones. West, 4 trumpets and 4 trombones. And south, 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, and 4 tubas. And Berlioz writes something very, very interesting. He writes, these 4 small, relatively speaking, brass wind orchestras must be placed separately at the 4 corners of the grand group of choral singers and instrumentalists. Only the French horns remain in the grand orchestra. Now, that's the brass. Then we get the percussion. So for the percussion, we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sets of timpani played by 10 timpanists. 2 of them are performed by 1 player on each drum, and the other 4 have 1 player for 2 drums. So that's that. Then there's a tenor drum in B flat. And that tenor drum in B flat is marked to be placed on its side, and the rolls executed with 2 kettle drum sticks. Then there's a regular bass drum with 2 drumsticks, 4 tam-tams, and 10 suspended cymbals that you whack with a timpani or bass drum stick, depending on what the stick is. And of course, so that's the giganto, special effects forces, in addition to what we've already discussed. So that is really what everybody tunes in for. It's like a hockey game. You watch it for the fights, right? It's the same thing with the Berlioz Requiem. You got to nail the big moments. If you don't nail the big moments, there is no point in listening to the Berlioz Requiem. No point whatsoever. There really isn't. I mean, it's a beautiful work, but here's the fascinating thing. The vast majority of it, as Berlioz kind of sneakily suggests, is really rather intimate. It's it's a sensitive, delicate, believe it or not, and exquisitely balanced work within these enormous forces. And you only have 3 or 4 really massive eruptions. But if you don't nail those massive eruptions, the whole thing is a snooze fest, the likes of which you cannot imagine. It's incredibly dull. You need to have the contrast that Berlioz built in. Well, so what's the first problem with most performances? Well, like this one, failure to nail the big moments. There is no excuse not to nail the big moments. None whatsoever. Berlioz is the epitome of musical grandiosity. And if you are embarrassed by that, just stay away from the piece. If you can't really indulge the huge, excessive, crass, vulgar pomposity and bombast, I mean, you just have no business even doing it. Because they have an artistic purpose, a genuine musical artistic purpose. They are very carefully worked out to create the maximum overwhelming apocalyptic effect. And boy, if you don't do that, then the whole piece develops an inferiority complex. It sounds like it's embarrassed with itself. And it becomes an epic failure. This is just too small. It's just too small a performance. The big moments just don't tell in this performance. And most performances of the Berlioz Requiem are done live, which is also a mistake. It should be done under controlled studio conditions wherever possible. Sometimes it can work live. I mean, it has, but most of the time you're so much better off doing it in a nice, controlled environment where you can get everything right. Because the other thing that Berlioz desperately needs, is clarity. Berlioz was a master of orchestration, a master of ensemble balance and texture, and his textures always need to be clear. There is no place worse to do a recording of the Berlioz Requiem than in a cathedral. Never, no place, because the whole thing gets swallowed up in pounds of reverberation. Have you ever heard a bass drum or like that timpani in a cathedral? You just get this furry, dull roar because the low end frequencies don't resonate in such a big space. They just flabbily diffuse. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And so when you do it in the cathedral, you are absolutely, there's no question it's going to be a disaster. Unless possibly you can do it under controlled circumstances and mic everything appropriately without an audience. But, this was doomed from the beginning. And this was, they both were for their various reasons. There are many versions that suffer from failure of vision. I mean, Ozawa's was one. I mean, a wonderful Berlioz conductor, but he's not a grandiose guy, right? I mean, I can just name them, it just doesn't matter. There's so many of them. And most of them suffer from sonic defects in one way or another, and it's just terrible. I mean, at the moment that the choir comes in that dies irae, after the fanfares have been going and the timpani and the bass drum come flying in, there is this enormous crash the second time around on the tam-tam and the cymbals. And Berlioz marks that whole moment with a fermata. One of the best ways to realize that was Colin Davis, who notes that the fermata is over the tam-tam and the cymbals as well. So instead of just going wham, he makes it a roll, a tremolo on those. So it's crash. In other words, he makes them hold it as long as the fermata gets held. That is Berliozian vision in operation. You can't do it to excess. Whatever you can achieve, you work out to make as loud and crazy a noise as possible, that's what you should do. And I just don't understand conductors who don't like noise doing this piece. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So, Berlioz gives us actually a very, very useful hint as to what one should do and why performances in cathedrals in these large spaces go wrong. Whenever I've heard it done in cathedrals, and I've heard a few, the brass gets placed at the four ends of the building. That's not what Berlioz said. And it always is important to listen to a genius when they give you advice. Berlioz's advice was, you place the brass at the four ends of the performing forces. Why? Well, it's a really obvious musical fact. He wants a coherent ensemble. He wants these various brass bands to be heard. He wants there to be a unified sound picture and a texture. And he doesn't want one to sound like it's on another planet or in another city or again, there are performances such as Bernstein's, which is one of the great ones, where it works. He's in Les Invalides, and it's this enormous space. So they're spread out over an enormous space, and some of them sound further than others. Okay. But normally, if you have an enormous space, you want your musical sound to be coming from a limited space to fill the enormous space from the front, right? I mean, Berlioz was very smart that way, but that's not what people do. That's not what they even do in concert halls where they try and stick everything everywhere. No, everybody's supposed to be in a relatively restricted space so that you can have rhythm and ensemble and coherence and have it sound like, a performance of something instead of a bunch of random objects in different places all blasting away. It's really kind of amazing. So there are 3 great recordings of the Berlioz Requiem. 3. That's it. All the rest of them you can throw in the trash. I mean, you may like them for a tenor, you like just one solo in the Sanctus, or you may like a certain, bit of something. And there is a Berlioz Requiem expert out there who sometimes contributes to our discussion. His name is Matthew Tepper. Hi, Matthew, who really knows the Berlioz Requiem. And back in the days of Rec Music Classical Recordings chat room, we used to go at it in the most obnoxious possible way, calling each other names and jumping up and down. But happily, we've all grown up since then. And we had a big discussion about how many percussionists it takes to play the percussion parts in the Berlioz Requiem. It was really very funny. But, so he may have, he may chime in with some details of other performances that are tolerable. But essentially, and I mean, Matthew recorded performances on major labels. I do not mean strange air checks and odd things that may have come your way from, out of the ether, however, or on YouTube or whatever that is. You know what I mean. Anyway, things that are available for people generally to listen to. The 3 best recordings are, there was the Colin Davis, which was sort of derided when it came out as being a little bit small scale, but it has the clarity. It's got to have the clarity, and that's the point. So I like it. I really like it. I think it's very well done, but that's me. Then there's the Bernstein on Sony, which somehow worked. I mean, no one's quite sure why it worked, but it worked. And it's Bernstein. I mean, it has tons of charisma and no fear of a lack of grandiosity on the conductor's part, which is what really matters. It was done in France with French forces, and some people say, well, it's a French choir and they suck because French choirs always suck. Well, yes, but the suckiness of the choir is part of the charm of the performance in this particular case, because there's just so much stuff going on all the time. Come on, who cares? So yes, there's that one. And then there is the ultimate, Charlemagne and the Boston Symphony. Now, this is a studio. That is a studio made in the concert hall of Boston Symphony Hall under controlled conditions. You can hear everything. It is Berlioz. It is Munch. It is, he's the great Berliozian. He just nails it. There is no performance that sounds even remotely like it. And that includes, by the way, Munch's second recording on Deutsche Grammophon with Bavarian radio forces, which is just terrible. I mean, it is, and it's the engineering. Again, it's small scale. The orchestra didn't have anything like the necessary cojones, the amplitude necessary to pull off the big moments. And Munch seemed not really to care terribly much. I think perhaps he realized that it just wasn't going to happen. It's not a bad performance, but it's a small scale performance. You never want to hear small scale Berlioz. You just don't. It's that simple. So, if you want to hear the Berlioz Requiem, you get this one, and you can really forget just about all the others. It's astonishing just how bad most of them are. So anyway, that's my vote for work most likely to fail. And it just sort of fascinates me that even today, in this modern day and age, with modern technology and fabulous digital recording and all of the resources available to do it right, they don't. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.